Hello, this is David Bergantino, author of the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror series. You're listening to the 80s Slasher Librarian's audiobook presentation of Help Wanted. Keep it scary.
Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Help Wanted, by David Bergantino. Chapter 13. Laura was roughly awakened just after 3 a.m. As her mother threw a robe at her and dragged her into the car, Laura could barely comprehend what was being said. Chester had been murdered. Shelby in the hospital after some sort of seizure. The murderer also found dead at the scene. It was only at the hospital that the story was told more fully, but it still made no sense. A police officer told Laura and her mother that they answered a complaint about pool jumpers at the municipal pool during the night. When we arrived at the premises, we heard nothing and almost left, figuring that if there had been any trespassers, they had been scared off. Then, just by chance, one of the other officers looked in and saw Chester floating face down in the middle of the pool. Then, the officer continued, we spotted another body near the edge of the pool. This turned out to be Warner Halbert. Beside his body, scrawled in his own blood, were the words "Help Wanted." Laura gasped. Her mother sat down. "But what about Shelby?" Laura stammered. "We found her unconscious, lying near the turnstiles of the locker room. At first we thought she was dead. Her face was covered with blood, her breathing was shallow, but she was alive." The doctor walked in and took it from there. "Shelby seems to have suffered a massive seizure due to a previously undiscovered injury, presumably sustained in her recent car accident. Had she complained of feeling unwell lately?" the doctor asked, but he continued before Laura could answer. "Anyway, the episode caused a nosebleed, which explains the blood." The police officer wrapped up the bizarre tale. "As best as we can determine, Shelby must have had her seizure and collapsed without Chester ever knowing about it, and before the arrival of the killer. She was hidden well enough that the killer never saw her. Otherwise, she surely would have been killed as well. As it is," the doctor said gravely, "she is in a coma, but in stable condition otherwise. We need to give her some time." Laura was in shock and could not speak. Somehow her mother found the strength to ask more questions. The main mystery turned out to be how Warner Halbert had died. "Heart attack, most likely," the doctor said hesitantly, after exchanging a strange glance with the police officer. "We haven't had much time to figure it out. You understand? Our first priority was your daughter, then the Carter boy. We'll have the rest of the puzzle sorted out by late morning, I expect." But he didn't appear too confident. With that, the doctor and the police officer escorted both Walcott women to Shelby's room. Laura almost cried when she saw her sister. She was hooked up to many more machines than she had been the last time, and her face seemed agonized rather than peaceful. Dried blood caked the inside of her nostrils. On the way home, both women cried. Laura's tears flowed for her sister's condition, but for other reasons as well. Self-pity was a big one. Doug was another. He had been telling the truth all along. Shelby had been seeing Chester behind Laura's back. Why else would Shelby have been at the pool at that time of night? Shelby had lied, repeatedly, and Doug had been punished for it. Laura had even gone so far as to suspect him of murder. How could he ever forgive her? Laura didn't even attempt to sleep when she returned home. She made coffee and read as the minutes crawled by. As soon as she could, she would go back to the hospital. While she kept a vigil for Shelby, she would figure out what to say to Doug. It would take more than a simple apology to make up for her behavior. Somehow, Laura's mother forced herself to go to work the next morning, taking some comfort in knowing that Laura would be at the hospital. Laura arrived at the hospital the minute visiting hours began. She held her sister's hand, praying for her to wake up. At least, she thought, this seemed to mark the end of the epidemic of violence that had been plaguing them. With Warner Halbert found, identified as the murderer, and too dead to be killing anyone else, the chain of death seemed to be broken. Still, there were wounds to be healed. If she came out of this, Shelby would have to justify the deceitful behavior that had nearly gotten her killed. and Laura had a lot to make up to Doug. But by the time noon rolled around, Shelby's eyes remained closed, and Laura had come no closer to figuring out how to approach Doug. The door opened, and Buck entered. "You okay?" he whispered, kneeling next to Laura. She could only shrug sadly. "Come out to the hall with me," Buck urged her. "I have to tell you something." When Laura's eyes lit with panic, Buck assured her that they wouldn't go far or be out of the room for long. Finally, she followed him out the door. "More news on the pipeline that I think you should know," he told her. "This isn't even going to be in the paper until the police can find a plausible story to replace it with." He took a deep breath before he explained. "They did an autopsy on Warner Halbert. He's been dead for several days. He couldn't have killed anyone." "But he was found at the pool this morning," Laura pointed out. "And what about his blood at the murder scene?" "The police are working on a pretty gruesome theory from what I've heard." He wiped his mouth with his sleeve, as if he had eaten something foul. His eyes darted around the corridor to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "They think Halbert had a heart attack and died the night he disappeared from the hospital. They think someone, the real murderer, took his body from the hospital and hid it while the murders were taking place." "But why in the world?" Laura stammered. "What about his blood?" "You don't want to know," Buck said, but Laura insisted she did. "They think the murderer took a bottle of blood with him and used it to implicate Halbert. Up until now, it's worked." "Then why dump the body now?" "Whoever it was probably didn't have a large enough refrigerator. The body was getting pretty rank, so the real killer decided to get rid of it before the stink gave him away." Laura was flabbergasted by the theory. It was morbid, sickening, but it made sense. There was only one thing missing. "Why?" she asked. "Why would anyone do this?" "I don't really know," Buck told her. "Maybe there is no reason." He shrugged, unable or unwilling to say more. Just then, Doug appeared, running down the hall toward them. "I just heard," he said breathlessly as he reached them. Laura didn't resist as he swept her into a rocking embrace. She immediately burst into tears. His compassion was unexpected and undeserved. "It's all right," he whispered into her ear. The show of affection visibly unnerved Buck. What are you doing here?" Buck sputtered. Doug released Laura but kept his arm around her shoulders. To her, it seemed perfectly natural. "Laura and Shelby are my friends," Doug told him, surprised at the question. "Why else?" "So you don't hate me?" Laura asked him tearfully. Doug laughed and shook his head. "Of course not." "Hey!" Buck interrupted manically. You can't just barge in here." To Laura, he pleaded. Remember what he did to you? And me, too. Unless there were 2 paint vandals that day." "What's your problem?" Doug asked, driven quickly to the near breaking point. "Calm down, Buck," Laura cautioned. "Doug didn't do anything. He didn't lie about Chester and Shelby, and he would never attack me." "What about me?" Buck asked angrily. "He's been wanting me out of the picture since the night of his party." "What are you talking about?" Laura was astounded. "He'd never get anywhere with you with me around, and he knew it." Buck started to pace as if he were a trial lawyer delivering a final summation. "So he's been trying to drive me away." "You're nuts!" Doug shouted. "If anything, someone's been trying to drive me and Laura apart. I thought it was Chester." He lowered his voice and stared straight at Buck. "I'm beginning to change my mind." Buck stopped pacing and met Doug's stare. Laura looked from one to the other. Impending violence was thick in the air. "He's the crazy one, Laura," Buck growled. "Remember the cut on his finger? Bet he's got some burns from cooking oil, too. You like your fries extra crispy, or just your ex-girlfriend's?" Without warning, Doug swung at Buck. Laughing, Buck easily dodged the blow and hammered Doug in the stomach. Doug doubled over and nearly collapsed. Buck was about to deliver another blow, but Laura stepped between them. "Stop it!" she cried. Did you see that?" Buck asked breathlessly, his adrenaline pumping. He attacked me." "You baited him, Buck!" Laura was furious. She wrapped her arms around Doug, who was gasping for breath. Then it came to her. She realized what had seemed odd at the pool yesterday. "How did you know about the cut on Doug's finger?" she asked warily. Buck was still pumped up and didn't see the trap. "At the pool, why?" "We never got close enough to see," she told him. Buck's eyes went wide. "It only happened the day before, and you didn't even see Doug the day before. Unless..." She released Doug and pointed at Buck's face. "You followed us to the mansion, didn't you? You stole the paint and did those terrible things to make me think Doug did them." Images of Allison, Rain, and Chester suddenly floated before her. Buck had a reason to kill every one of them, and his reason was to prove himself to her. "What else did you do, Buck? What else did you do?" Buck recoiled like a vampire from across, then, seeing the terror in her eyes, he seemed to read her thoughts. He straightened up, a dark smile on his face. His eyes bored into her. "Wouldn't you like to know?" he purred. "Pray you don't ever find out." With the sneer, Buck spun on his heels and hurried away. Laura turned to Doug. "Did you hear that? He did it! He killed them! And now he knows I know!" Doug shook his head. "He's bluffing, Laura." "Did you see his eyes?" she cried. "I can't just let him get away with it!" Then she almost laughed despite her upset. A week ago, she would have been more than happy to let Buck go. "I'm sure there's nothing he'd like more than for you to falsely accuse him of murder. You'll make a fool out of yourself. It's exactly what he wants." Doug held her by the shoulders to keep her from running off. For a moment, she considered elbowing Doug in the stomach to get away, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He was very concerned for her at this moment, and Laura realized she was very close to losing control of herself. "But what if you're wrong?" Laura asked, still very much afraid. "You haven't believed a word I've said for days," Doug said with a kind smile. "But trust me on this one, if only because you owe me." "Okay," she told him, and he hugged her close. Doug remained at the hospital with Laura for the rest of the day. Her mother joined the vigil for a while after work, but then left because she was exhausted. So was Laura, but she wouldn't leave until the nurses told her that visiting hours were over and made her go. They insisted Shelby would be all right. Her condition hadn't improved, but she was stable. At least Buck hadn't shown his face after that last encounter. She didn't share her fears with Doug, but part of the reason she had stayed so long was that she didn't want Shelby to be left alone. Buck knew his way around the hospital, and he was predictably unpredictable. Who knew what was really going on in his head or what he would do to get back at Laura for rejecting him? Because now she had rejected him. Over the course of the day, she had come to see the difference between Buck and Doug. The contrast was stark, and suddenly the planets had aligned. Doug and Laura were at the same place now. By the time they left, Doug knew that too. And best of all, neither had to say a word. It was simply understood. Doug followed Laura home, and when they got there, Laura found a note from her mother. She had gone to bed early and had taken a couple of sleeping pills to help her. She'd be out for the night. "That means we can listen to speed metal at high volume and she still won't wake up," Laura joked. She was caught in the whirlwind of excitement, relief, fear, and sadness. Sleep seemed like a good idea, but she didn't want Doug to leave just yet. He agreed to stay and watch a movie with her. Turning off all the lights in the living room, they pretended they were in a movie theater and lost themselves in the movie. When it was over, Laura couldn't remember at what point they had started holding hands. She was happy. Then, the phone rang. "Hey, you gorgeous," drawled a sardonic voice. "What do you want, Buck?" Laura answered calmly. Doug heard and came right over. He started to take the receiver away from her, but she wouldn't let him. "I dunno. I'd been off work for a while, relaxing, and I was wondering how you were doing." His voice sounded far away and dreamy. "You're drunk, aren't you?" This produced a gale of laughter from Buck. "No! This comes naturally. If anything, I'm cleaner than usual. Yep. Decided not to take the pills my doctor insists I take." "Pills?" "Yep," he chirped. "My shrink gives me these things that kinda keep me on an even keel most of the time." A little sinisterly, he repeated, "Most of the time." Then he was bright and cheerful again. "But I'm not in the mood to be on an even keel, you know. Sometimes I like it when the boat's a-rockin' a bit. A little rock, a little roll. Gotta love it." "You should get some sleep, Buck." She was trying to sound neutral, but apparently she tried too hard. "Don't patronize me!" he shouted. Then, just as instantly, he acted as if his outburst had never happened. "I'm not really sleepy. Hard to sleep during the rock and roll, you know, so I thought I'd go visit a friend of mine in the hospital." Laura tensed. "You stay away from Shelby." "Tell you what, let's play a little game." The idea of a game made him giggle. The sound gave Laura chills. "I'll race you to your sister's room, winner take all." "How's that?" "Buck, don't." His voice overrode hers. "I'm on my way, and don't waste time. You know how long it takes to complete even a 911 call, and those hospital phones just ring forever. See you there, and maybe we'll talk. And remember, winner takes all." "We have to get to the hospital," Laura shouted before Doug could speak. They raced out the door. "What's a game without a cheat?" Buck asked himself as he climbed a back stairway at the hospital. He had called from a payphone just outside. Laura could never reach the hospital in time. In time for what? Now there was the $64,000 question. That's for me to know and Laura to find out. Buck chuckled to himself as he exited the stairwell. Shelby's room was just down the hall. Ah, the things he had done to ensure Laura would be his. The conspiracy, the crimes. Yes, the crimes. Buck checked the hallway. It was empty. He continued toward Shelby's room. He had done so much, but Laura had still rejected him. And she wasn't just playing hard to get any longer. She was playing never to get. He put his hand on the doorknob of Shelby's room. As he looked to the left and right, the hallway appeared to be empty. Buck slipped silently into Shelby's room. Shelby lay there in a pained sleep. Now it was time to wait for Laura to arrive. In the meantime, there was one last thing to do. Buck smiled grimly and withdrew the straight razor from his pocket. Chapter 14. Laura and Doug burst through the emergency room doors. "You get security," Laura ordered. "I'll go up to Shelby's room." "You shouldn't go up there alone," Doug insisted. "I have to. Maybe it's the only thing that'll keep Buck from doing something crazy." "If he hasn't already." They both knew this was a possibility, but Laura felt she had already wasted too much time to argue. "Just do it. I'll be okay." With that, she ran off. Doug seemed almost frozen in place, torn between following her and calling security. Laura couldn't worry about that. She just had to hope his paralysis would end so he could do his part and get help. The elevator couldn't reach the 3rd floor fast enough. Laura pounded on the open door button as soon as the 3 lit up on the panel above her. At the first movement of the doors, she immediately tried to force them open faster. The doors themselves seemed to resist her as if on Buck's orders. "Come on!" she yelled and squeezed out the opening as soon as there was room. The hallway seemed dimmer than it should be, and Laura realized that someone had turned off most of the overhead lights. It made the going slow, but she finally reached Shelby's room. Inside it was even darker. "Buck?" she called tentatively from the doorway. There was no answer. She reached for the light switch on the wall. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed to life, and Laura shrank against the door frame in horror. Covering Shelby's bed was a swarm of plastic tubing. The liquid in it now, though, was red. Blood was backing up into them. Shelby's blood. Laura forced herself to move toward the bed. So thick was the tangle of tubing, she could not even see her sister's face. On the wall behind the bed in dripping red letters were the words, "Help Wanted." Tears welled in Laura's eyes. She glanced at the other end of the bed. Something was wrong. It was the size of the feet. Somebody had neglected to remove Shelby's shoes. Pulling the sheet off, Laura discovered black tennis shoes. She recognized them instantly. As quickly as she could, she cleared away some of the tubing obscuring the patient's face. On his face was etched terror greater than any Laura had ever seen before. Buck lay in the hospital bed, dead. The unearthly laughter began then. It didn't come from any particular place in the room, but surrounded her. It was a harsh, cruel rasp, and it threatened to close in and crush Laura. The sound of a dead bolt sliding into place came through the laughter. That sound Laura could pinpoint, and she spun toward the door. There stood Shelby in her bloody hospital gown. Twin streams of thick red liquid gushed from her nose. As she pulled her hand away from the lock, Shelby was laughing. Somehow that sourceless sound was emanating from her. Her eyes were bloodshot, cold, evil. Not Shelby's at all.
"So, are you going to apply for any of these jobs, or what?"
Shelby's voice croaked. It was like listening to two voices at once. Shelby's doubled by that of some ancient evil thing a millisecond behind. The sound was disorienting. "What are you talking about?" Laura's voice was quivering with terror.
"What do you think?"
answered the double-voiced monster that had been her sister.
"You wanted a job so badly. I gave you 4 wonderful opportunities."
The thing started walking toward Laura.
"Although, I know you weren't keen on working at the hospital. Things are a little dead around here."
It gestured to Buck and laughed again. Laura wanted to retch, scream, and fall to the floor, clutching her ears at the same time. Somehow she remained on her feet and back toward the curtain that divided the room in half. Earlier today, that far half of the room had been empty, save for some equipment.
"Let me introduce myself,"
said the dual voices.
"I'm Freddy Krueger."
"That's impossible!" Laura cried in disbelief. "He's been dead for years." One sinister eyebrow went up and the thing laughed again. When it stopped, the voice was deadly serious.
"Don't bet on it."
Instantly, Laura knew the voice was telling the truth. Before her stood Shelby, possessed by Freddy Krueger. Laura became certain of one other thing. Her life was nearly over. Despite that realization, or perhaps emboldened by it, Laura stopped backing away. "You leave my sister alone!" she yelled. The thing just laughed.
mean, fire her? Why, she's been my invaluable employee.
It gestured toward Buck's inert form.
Her latest masterwork. Of course, he had meant to kill himself over you anyway. He was about to slash his wrist so you'd find him beside your sister.
Another chilling laugh.
We changed his, job description.
Laura had begun to back up. She bumped against a water cooler, nearly upsetting it.
How about coming to work for me? You set 'em up, and me and your sister will, as they say, knock 'em dead.
I'd never be responsible for someone else's death, Laura yelled defiantly.
You already have been,
the thing replied.
Of course, it has been, on a freelance basis. You didn't even know what you were doing, with all the applications you filled out. Death certificates. That's what they really were.
No! She couldn't believe she was somehow responsible for the tragedy that had befallen Buck and the others. She refused to believe it.
Yes, you wanted the job, no matter what. I saw it in your dreams. I'm good at seeing things like that.
He chuckled.
Now, I'll put you on the payroll. The pay is good. You and your sister will live, and that pretty much covers the benefits as well.
Never! Laura glanced at the door, where was Doug and the cavalry. Freddy directed Shelby to move forward.
Let me tell you this,
he hissed.
If you refuse, your sister will die of a brain hemorrhage tonight.
It licked its lips.
Of course, I have to decide whether to let you live to see that happen.
Let me tell you something, Laura found herself saying. A look of surprise temporarily interrupted the menace set in Shelby's face. You're giving me my sister back, and you're going back to where you came from, and this time, flush it! The thing froze. It studied Laura as if judging her, a real threat. Then its eyes went wide, and it burst into fresh, evil laughter.
You had me going there for a second, little girl,
it gasped. Then all humor drained instantly away.
Turn down the position at your own peril. Most people would die for a job like this. Many have.
Then it moved forward. Clearly the end was here. It would kill her. That didn't bother Laura nearly as much as she thought. How could she fight some otherworldly bully like Freddy Krueger? She had heard the rumors but never believed them. Despite all the mysterious, violent deaths in Springwood, she had always believed they were performed by copycats or devotees. How could she have conceived that the real Freddy Krueger kept returning?
That's right,
Freddy told her soothingly.
Give yourself to me. I can always make you a lifeguard for my tent pole.
Just like that, rage flooded into Laura. Freddy's comment reminded her of the beginning of this deadly chapter in her life. All she had wanted to do was have a job, her family, a boyfriend, and her friends. Then Chester had fired her, Shelby had been forced to lie to her, and Buck had come into her life and tried to hijack it for his own selfish needs. Now here was some demon attempting to do the same thing. No way. If you plan on killing Shelby, she growled, I guess I have nothing to lose. With that, she grabbed the nearest metal object, a bedpan, and hurled it at Shelby's head. It struck with a loud clang. Freddy just laughed, safe inside Shelby's body.
This is going to hurt her a lot more than it'll hurt me,
he declared, and kept walking inexorably forward. Laura was aware that she didn't have the slightest idea of what to do next. Despite her resolve to defeat Freddy, she couldn't see herself stabbing at her sister with a scalpel, even if she came across one. a cluster of machinery huddled in a far corner of the room. Running to it, she pulled out a heavy EKG machine. It was on rollers and moved easily. Still, it should pack some punch, she figured, and pushed it with all of her might at Shelby. With a snicker and superhuman strength, Freddy batted the EKG machine away as if it were a plastic toy. Laura pushed out another machine, one she did not recognize. Again, it did little but halt Freddy's progress for a moment. This gave Laura time to scan the room. Her eyes finally landed on something that might help. On a counter behind her rested a small machine with handles, like air hockey paddles. It was the defibrillator, like she had seen on the myriad of television hospital dramas used to resuscitate heart attack victims. A flicker of apprehension darted across Shelby's face when Freddy saw what Laura had spied. Laura knew she was on the right track. She pushed one last piece of equipment at her sister and ran for the defibrillator.
"You can't win! You know that!"
Freddy taunted.
"You still have a chance to save yourself and your sister. Just think of the power you could wield through me!"
Laura flipped the switch on the defibrillator. A high-pitched whine indicated it was charging. She held up the paddles and faced her enemy. "This is the only power I need!" Laura didn't know if that was true, but she advanced on Shelby anyway. Shelby attacked with outstretched arms. Laura dodged them. Freddy was moving clumsily, it now seemed. Was Shelby in there trying to fight Freddy? Laura couldn't think about that. She only acted, bringing the paddles down on Shelby's chest. For kicks, she yelled, "Clear!" The paddles never touched Shelby, but a jolt sent her flying backward. At the same time, a shape materialized briefly around Shelby's form. Laura saw it for a flashing moment, a burned, gnarled creature with eyes of pure evil. A tattered green and red sweater covered livid flesh. Then he blinked off as if someone had pulled the plug on a gruesome Christmas tree. "Thought you'd get a charge out of that," Laura said after she recovered from the amazing glimpse of Freddy. It was the same scarred creature who had appeared as Warner Halbert in her nightmare. Shelby staggered forward again, almost shambling, but the hate in her eyes had not diminished even slightly. This time, Laura didn't wait to be attacked. She rushed forward, and with a feint, planted the paddles on Shelby's chest once more. Again, Freddy burst into view around Shelby. Anger and frustration were clear in his expression. The vision disappeared as Shelby's body flew backward into the water cooler. This time it did topple and landed on the ground next to Shelby. The bottle bounced once, breaking free of the dispenser, and water poured from it. Shelby was slowly moving, splashing in the spreading puddle as if drowning in a deep pool. Laura moved forward once more, but the wires securing the paddles to the machine had reached their limits. Freddy would have to come after her if she was to attack again, but he would be prepared now and would stay out of range until he could strike. Just then the pounding started on the door. "Laura! Are you in there? Laura!" It was Doug. Down the hall, other shouting voices approached. Soon the hospital personnel would unlock the door and flood in. More people would be in danger. She had to end this now, and she knew how. Freddy had gained control of Shelby's body and was beginning to stand. He glanced toward the door and licked his lips once more. Then he returned his gaze to Laura, smugly confident that she was unable to attack with the defibrillator machine. He was wrong. Dropping to the floor, Laura plunged the paddles into the puddle of water, the edge of which began just before her. There was a tremendous jolt, one that was sustained as electricity poured out of the machine and into the water, and coursed through Shelby's body. Freddy appeared again, this time his form flickering on and off with the ebb and flow of electricity. Each time, his image stayed in view longer until Laura could no longer see Shelby through him. He fell to the floor shrieking in agony. Laura pressed her hands to her ears to close out the sound. In the water, Freddy writhed and splashed. The lights of the room began to dim as power was diverted and circuits began to overload. Doug shouted from the other side of the door, his shouts becoming more frantic. A key finally entered the lock, but panic prevented it from being turned easily. The room became a strobing terror disco, flashing light and dark. Freddy on the floor, then Shelby. Then the room went completely black. Apparently, power went out all over. The struggling with the lock stopped momentarily. Laura could sense no movement within the room. She held her breath, waiting to see what would happen next. She looked up toward the sound of the key being slid smoothly into the lock and turned swiftly. Just as the door opened, the emergency generators kicked in and an eerie twilight filled the room. Several doctors, nurses, and security officers froze in the doorway as they beheld the chaos. Doug pushed past them, paused briefly at the side of Shelby, and ran toward Laura.
"My God!" he cried. "Are you okay?"
"I don't know," she answered, looking past him. "Shelby!" He turned. The crowd had pushed its way into the room. A doctor and some nurses were crouched over Shelby, while security and another doctor viewed Buck's ghastly remains. Laura and Doug went over to Shelby. "Is she dead?" she asked, swallowing hard. A doctor looked up in shock. He gave her a piercing look, trying to place this room in some sort of recognizable universe in his mind. Obviously, he was failing. "No, she seems to be alive," he finally said. He continued to scrutinize her. "What the hell?" Laura ignored him. "Find out if she's all right for real. I have to talk to the police." "Yes," was all he could say in reply. Then he nodded to the nurses. They sprang into action, one bringing over a gurney on which to place Shelby. They were anxious to avoid dealing with Buck's body. At the security guard's request, Laura allowed herself to be escorted to a waiting area until the police arrived. They allowed Doug to remain with her throughout her questioning by a stone-faced detective named Farthing. He asked her to relate her version of the evening's events and listened without interrupting. Betraying no emotion, no clue as to whether he believed her or not, he asked for clarification on a few items. "You believe the killer to be Freddy Krueger. Your sister was possessed by Krueger. Buck had come to kill himself in your sister's room, despondent over you." Laura answered each question with an affirmative. Detective Farthing nodded to himself and hummed, still poker-faced. He flipped his notes back to the beginning and made a mark next to an item. "You said that on the phone, Buck claimed to be taking some sort of prescription mood leveler?" "Yes." Laura braced herself, waiting for Detective Farthing to declare her insane or lying and haul her away. Detective Farthing only replied by nodding once more. Then he stood, walked toward the back of the little room, as if working out something in his head. Then turned back to Laura. "The way I see it," he mused aloud, "your friend Buck wasn't quite playing with a full deck." He nodded again, as if making sure that this made sense and deciding it did. "We'll probably find some violent behavior in his past, and you said he didn't always take his medication." "That's what he told me," Laura reiterated. Farthing was beginning to spook her a bit. "Yes," he said, nodding as if to some internal counsel. "So, it appears to me that, Buck stopped taking his medication, became more and more unstable, took the lives of your schoolmates, then his own life. It's very simple." He was now staring intensely at Laura. "But it wasn't Buck," Laura reminded him. "It was Freddy working through my sister." Detective Farthing leaned forward on the table with his stone face inches away from Laura's. "It's very simple," he repeated calmly. "Buck did it. He's dead. No investigation, no fireworks, no one else gets hurt. Got that?" A trace of menace had crept into his voice. "Don't you believe me?" Laura asked, trying to get past his defenses. "Let's just say I like my story better," he said, standing to full height. "It's cleaner, don't you think? And better for everyone involved, especially you and your sister." Now Laura saw what he was doing. Detective Farthing did believe her, but he knew no one else would. He was constructing an easier-to-swallow version of events to protect both her and, likely, a beleaguered police department that had an astronomically high number of homicides per capita. It was a cover-up, but one that she and Shelby would supposedly benefit from. "I see," Laura said solemnly, and stood. Detective Farthing turned to Doug, who had remained silent through the whole interview. "What about you, sport?" "Cleanliness is next to godliness, they say." He, too, stood. "I vote for your story." Farthing raised an eyebrow. Laura took that as an expression of relief. He let them go, and neither she nor Doug was ever questioned again on the subject. The two officially became an item, after Laura found herself saying these words to him. "I'm yours, if you want me. I'd do anything for you." As for Shelby, she awoke the next day fully alert and was out of the hospital 2 days after that. The doctors proclaimed her recovery a miracle. No sign of trauma from the car accident remained. One thing that did remain was her memory of how horrible she had been to Laura. "I'd like to say the devil made me do it or something," she told Laura seriously. "But he only really controlled me when he wanted to kill someone. The lying, the sneaking around, that was all me." Laura instantly forgave her anyway, but she had a question. "Is Freddy still with you?" She couldn't shake the feeling that he was still lurking somewhere, waiting to spring out. "No, Freddy's gone. I know that for sure." Shelby's conviction was unshakable. "I think once you reject him, he's not able to return. I can't say how I know that. It's just something I feel." Laura took her sister's word for it, but worry still must have shown on her face. "Heck," Shelby told her cheerily. "Maybe you got rid of him once and for all." Laura smiled but shook her head. She remembered Freddy's words on the subject.
Don't bet on it!
Epilogue.
I guess it's time to take down the help wanted sign, eh? With 4 new recruits for the Boiler Room Brigade. I've got almost all the help I could want. Dear Allison, she has been hired to try on all the new Boiler Room fashions. Talk about hot clothing! But unfortunately, the only fabric we use down here is asbestos, so they're not exactly the most flattering of fashions. No doubt she'll experience job burnout very soon. It would break my heart if I had one. Chester could use what she's got, however. He is working as a beach model. Unfortunately, he's become the 90-pound weakling who gets sand kicked into his face. And who's doing the kicking? Why, it's his old friend Buck. The bad news for Buck, and worse news for Chester, is that we just can't keep sand in a place like the Boiler Room. It just turns to glass. So we've replaced all the sand with lava. How'd you like a face full of that? Chester sure doesn't like it, but he wanted a job where all he does is remain in one place and do nothing. Well, that's what he does when Bug kicks lava in his face. Nothing! And he does it so well! Don't think Buck's got it so good. Not only does he have a hot foot to deal with, but remember Rain? Now, there was a tacky girl. Since her accident with the deep fryer, She's become even tackier. In fact, she and Buck are joined at the hip. Literally. Her flesh is melted to his, and she escorts him everywhere. And Lucky Buck gets an up-close and personal view of her boil-covered, charred flesh. Sounds like my kind of girl. They may complain about their work, but they're lucky, really. Who else has job security like them? Since each one is consigned to the boiler room for eternity, they can never be fired. On the other hand, since they are in a boiler room, they will be fired repeatedly throughout their never-ending careers. Too bad I haven't installed a water cooler yet.
This has been Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror, Help Wanted by David Bergantino. I'm sad to see this one end. There's 6 of these books altogether. And we just did 3 of them back to back to back here on the channel, and that was Virtual Terror, Twice Burned, and Help Wanted. That was books number 3, 4, and 5 in the 6-book series. Books 1 and 2 were written by a guy named Bruce Richards. We're going to be narrating those a little later on, but they don't have any cross stories with these like these did. And a while back I narrated book number 6, which was also by David Bergantino, and I did that one early because it's like the most rarest book in the collection, and I came across it and I really wanted to get it on the channel because so many people were having a hard time finding it or affording it. It was going for like a couple $1,000s. I lucked out and got it at a steal. So yeah, completing Help Wanted here is the last David Bergantino book on the channel. I did speak with him, and he wrote a couple of these books called Spine Chillers back in the day. They were kind of like Goosebumps, and I'm going to narrate those on the channel for fun a little later on. David Bergantino is a great author. Thank you so much, David, for letting me narrate your books. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a pleasure, been an honor, and I've had a blast. And now I'm going to kind of give a quick little review of Help Wanted. If you've been listening along with the chapter uploads I've done, I've given my discussion and my guesses, and I'm just going to break down everything that we've covered before tonight really fast, and then break down the conclusion. So here goes. I really like the characters in this book. The guys were all kind of, you know, maybe not the greatest people in the world, especially Buck and Chester. Oh my god. Doug ended up being a better character than he was made out to look for most of the book. You know, I knew Buck from the very first chapter when we met Buck. We could all tell there was something wrong with that guy. As you go through the book, he just gets darker and darker and crazier and crazier. I like the aspect of the dream of the crash. After the crash happens, she has the nightmares, and, you know, that Halbert guy is behind the wheel, has a heart attack in real life, and in the dream, he turns into Freddy. And this wreck happens. You know, I gotta say, these young adult novels, a lot of things that turn people off is like the high school drama, but I really enjoyed that in this book. And, you know, the whole love thing, the mess with Chester and Laura's little sister Shelby, even with Doug and Rain and them breaking up and Doug wanting to be with Laura, Chester breaking up with Laura and wanting to get with her little sister to get revenge, and all along Buck is working with Rain. It's just, it was good. You know, it was a lot of drama going on, but it was engaging. It pulled us into the story, and it kept us guessing because we didn't know what was going on with all these people behind the scenes, the pages, you know, between the pages that we don't get to, the stuff we're not privy to from the story. And when all those dots started getting connected throughout the story, it just made it more and more intriguing, and I just couldn't put the book down. I kept wanting to get back to it as quick as possible. The deaths I thought were some of the best in the series so far as the Tales of Terror series, especially the deep fry death. Oh my God, David, that was twisted. The girl getting her head deep fried. I will say my guess was correct. I had guessed Shelby. A couple things back in the beginning of the book were suspect about her. Some curiosities. I was like, that doesn't sound just right. I don't know. She was on my maybe list for about the first half of the book. And as we came upon like the third act of the book, I was putting her as the killer. She was my main suspect. Halbert, 2 on the nose. Chester, asshole but not killer material. He didn't sound like he was possessed. Buck, I thought, had killed at least one person. You know, I thought we were going to find out he killed Chester. Honestly, I was. But even though I knew he wasn't the one that was possessed by Freddy. So, out of the 4 books, this is the second time that I've guessed the killer correctly. I guessed another killer in one of the other books, but I don't want to say it in case you haven't listened to that one yet. But yeah, so Shelby being the killer was great. And I really enjoyed how everything came down to this like love triangle thing with Buck, Doug, and Laura, okay? And even the thing with Chester and Shelby. But like when Doug took her out to the Appleby mansion and they had their dinner and he, you know, was like, got rejected by her, and in his ire and everything, he told her about Shelby and Chester. And the whole thing where she just flips out on him, you know, and somebody was following them. We found out that was Buck later. But like the spray-painted message, Shelby and Chester sitting in a tree. And then Buck being psychotic and putting paint on his own car and everything going against Doug. That was just so messed up. This Buck guy was a psycho. So when it came to the pull thing and he mentioned the cut on Doug's finger, I was even thinking at the time, I don't know if I mentioned this in my prior breakdowns, but I was even thinking, how did he know about the cut finger? Because he's not close to the guy. You know, and I was thinking, okay, yeah, you know, he knows more. Of course, we got the revelation from, you know, Rain's death in her little inner monologue that she'd been working with Buck. Sent him there, but it was more of me saying, you know, how does he know about the cut? Why is she not picking up on that? But we find out in the conclusion here that she did. You know, it just took her a while for that to click. But yeah, I was like, he wouldn't know about that, so why doesn't she know about that? Why isn't she picking up on that? So I really appreciated it when she did pick that up. But yeah, so Shelby ends up being there when Chester dies, but we get another red herring, another bait and switch, because when we picked up on the conclusion in the last couple chapters, and we find out about Chester being found by the police drowned in that pool, and the whole Halbert body being there too, this missing patient who's been missing since the car wreck, and everybody's like thinking he's the killer. I knew it wasn't him. You know, even as I was reading it, I was like, no, something's going to come up. And then the revelation that he'd have been dead for days. I was like, oh, yep, that is so twisted. The killer's been carrying around this rotten body. But then again, Freddy wouldn't care about that too much, you know. Unless it started messing with his plans, the stink and stuff. I guess that's why they left it behind. But when they found Shelby there, you know, passed out, and then the Halbert's dead body, and Chester's like, yep, it's Shelby, it's Shelby, it's Shelby, damn it, it's Shelby. I kind of hope Buck had killed Chester just so there'd be like an extra killer in the book that wasn't possessed. And I was a little let down by that, David, but then you brought it home when Buck called Laura at home with Doug and said let's play a game, whoever gets to Shelby first. And, you know, him breaking in, like, slowly slipping into insanity on the phone and switching back to trying to sound normal. Great stuff there. Very dark, very twisted. It gave us what you had been teasing with Buck from the beginning of the book. And, you know, you gave us just enough of his insanity. It would have been cool to actually witness, like, read him getting killed by Shelby, like, whenever he goes in there, getting ready to off himself. You know, Shelby sets up in, like, that weird dull Freddy voice, you know, like, let me do it for you. But, you know, sometimes the best stuff is what we don't see and what we don't read. It's the stuff between the pages. And that made for a really good revelation for Laura whenever she rushes to the hospital, you know, Buck had cheated. He was already there, and he was going to go in there and kill himself. She gets there, thinks Laura, sees all the tubes messed up, finds Buck's dead body. Big revelation there, big shocker too. And I was like, oh shit, you know. And then that showdown with Freddy, you know, that was a lot of fun. It was hard to voice that, trying to come up with this voice that was kind of a mixture of Shelby and Freddy, up until Freddy kind of just took over with it. But I hope I pulled that off decently. Listeners, hope you enjoyed that. That wasn't supposed to be just Freddy's voice. That was supposed to be like a mixture of Freddy and Shelby, like the book called for at first. And then it slowly became just Freddy. But I love the defibrillator. God, I always mess up saying that. I love that whole thing being the weapon she used against him. And separating them, and I really like the fact that the Springwood detective, knew enough about the Freddy legacy that he believed her, and he helped her fill in the gaps, fill in these little pieces of the story to sell it, so her and her sister could go on having a normal life, even though her sister had killed these people. But the detective knew about Freddy, because the cops would, they would have to after a while. The way people were killed by Freddy. So big kudos there, David. I really look forward to talking about this one on the podcast. But I really enjoyed this one. It's right up there with Virtual Terror with me. I hope all you listeners enjoyed this book. I hope you enjoyed the conclusion, the final fight, as much as I did. I love the whole opening of the book with Freddy and the closing of the epilogue with Freddy, in his boiler room talking to us about what the cast of characters are up to after they died. I think they all got a justified fate, to be honest with you. And Buck and Rain being attached at the hip, it's great. Chester being a little weakling, Hey, I'm not supposed to be this small. What's going on? I'm supposed to be a beefcake. What's going on? I'd rather be in the Poconos right now. Getting lava kicked in his face. Love it.
And I hope you loved it too.
And I'll be back very soon with some more Slasher Mayhem here on the 80 Slasher Librarians YouTube channel. And we're bringing a close to the Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror books by David Bergantino. We will check out the 2 that were written by Bruce Richards sometime soon, probably early 2021. They're called Fatal Games and Blind Date, I believe. And once we do those, that'll wrap up the entire Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror young adult book series. And until then, we're going to put out as much awesome content as we can. The next book on the menu is Friday the 13th, Part 3 by Simon Hawke. So I'll see you very soon with some of that. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80 Slasher Librarian saying thanks for listening, be excellent to each other,
pleasant dreams,
and thank you, David, for these awesome books. Everybody, have a great night. And if you've got a little extra time, check out the show Slash Tracks on the channel here. It's like Mystery Science Theater 3000 with a horror twist. We do complete movie riff commentaries. Starting with episode 6, we really embrace the whole Mystery Science Theater aspect. We have a masked villain on the show named Master Evil. He's the one forcing me and my co-host Alex Vanover to watch these bad movies. Sometimes we include the entire movie with the episode. Sometimes if we can't include the movie due to copyright reasons, we let you guys know when to hit play on your copy of the movie, so you're queued up with our riff commentary. It's very funny. All comedy once we get to the riffing, and it's a lot of fun. The movies are always bad, and we have a lot of fun with them, and I think you will too. If you do watch an episode that doesn't have the movie included, check the description, because I will include a link to either the movie, where you can watch it for free, along with and then you can queue up with our commentary, or I will include a link to where you can watch a version of the episode with the movie included with our commentary all in one video on Google Drive. That way you can see the whole thing without it affecting the YouTube copyright things. Hope you guys enjoy it. I would love your feedback on the show. Like I said, episode 6 is where we really hit our stride and the show became what it is now and what it's going to remain. Before that, we did a couple kind of serious, half comedy review riffs riff commentaries for Jason X and Freddy's Dead, and we followed that up with riff commentaries to Ghoulies, Ghostbusters 2016, and Troll 2. But those had we did the whole riff commentary thing and let you know when to hit play on your copy. But starting with episode 6, we had the whole wraparound segments at the beginning and end of the show with Master Evil and him letting us know what we're watching that night. Then the riffing happens with the whole movie, if we can include it. And then it ends with Master Evil letting us know what's coming the next time, stuff like that. Lots of fun on these little comedy bits, and I think you'll enjoy the show if you'll give it a chance. Episodes 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all available on the channel. And check them out. Episode 11 is coming out in just a few days. And I'm going to end the upload here with the intro, the animated intro and theme song for Slash Tracks, to give you an idea of the vibe and humor of the show. I'd appreciate it if you check it out. Hit the playlist section up here on the channel. There's a playlist for all the episodes of Slash Tracks so far. Alright guys, see you next time.
When Master Evil comes to play and Mother says that it's okay, Alex and Josh are stowed away and made to watch these movies, to stay alive until the